Hi, and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On today's episode, we'll be considering Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, developed by Sledgehammer and published by Activision. Usually, when we cover a Call of Duty title on History Respawned, we discuss the depiction of the Second World War or the War on Terror. But today, we're doing something different. We're going to use the latest Call of Duty as the basis for a conversation about America and guns, particularly the development of American gun culture in the late 20th century. To help me with this conversation, I've invited onto the show my old colleague, Dr. Andrew McKevitt. Dr. McKevitt is the John D. Winters Endowed Professor of History at Louisiana Tech University. His new book is Gun Country: Gun Capitalism, Culture, and Control in the Cold War, which was recently included in the Washington Post's list of best nonfiction books for 2023. Drew, welcome to History Respawned.
Hi, Bob. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on your show here. I've been a long-time admirer. I have assigned my students to watch many episodes of your show over the years, and it's really great. It's terrific what you do.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Drew. So, Drew, the book that you've written, Gun Country, it explores the development of America into the gun country. And you place the start of the story in the post-war period. And I'm wondering, could you explain why this period after the Second World War is so important for understanding America's relationship with guns?
Yeah, sure. So there are a lot of ways to answer that question. The first is to acknowledge that people have, it's not uncommon for Americans to think about their country historically as a gun country, right? Certainly the United States was a gun country in the 18th century, and it was a gun country in the 19th century, and arguably it was the gun country in the 19th century. And there are a lot of ways in which some form of gun culture exists in the United States in the 18th and 19th century. But what I think happens after the Second World War is that there are a number of shifts in what I refer to as gun capitalism that explains how this particular moment after 1945 changes the way that Americans relate to guns. And maybe the two most important and relevant, especially when we're talking about a game like Call of Duty, which is a game in which you are operating as some sort of soldier or operator, the term they use, with military-style firearms. There's two big things that happen after the Second World War. The first is that the availability of guns increases dramatically. So if we look at the numbers in 1945, as best we can tell, there's about 45 million guns in the United States, and that's for a population of maybe 140 million people. By 2023, 75-ish, 80 years later, we're talking about a population that has increased about 2.5 times, but a gun stockpile, a civilian gun stockpile, that has increased 10 times over, or 1,000%. Today is, again, as best we could tell, we might be talking about 450 million guns in the United States. So there's no doubt that the United States was some kind of gun country in the 18th and 19th century, but it was not a gun country absolutely flooded with guns to the extent it is today, where we have more guns than people in the United States. And that's a condition that's never existed anywhere else in the world at any time that we know of. The other thing to consider here is what kinds of guns we're talking about specifically after the Second World War. And I think this connects really well with Call of Duty and the popularity of Call of Duty and the ways in which Call of Duty has contributed to gun culture in the United States. Bob, I'm just so impressed with your playing right now. This can't actually be you. This must be somebody else. Are you watching some professional players
Maybe
feed
I'm
here?
playing against bots here. I don't know what's going on. This is the
That might
best
be
I've ever done.
possible. This is real. I've
Oh,
never played this
oh
well.
no!
Somebody's gonna get you.
Somebody had
So,
a
all
neon
right.
gun.
Well,
So there you go.
the
Yeah.
streak had to come to an end with the neon gun. It was a perfect example, right? So what happens after the Second World War is we get an increase in the availability of guns, and there's two really kind of key characteristics in the availability of the kinds of guns we see after the Second World War. And one is that they're cheap. They're incredibly cheap, so much cheaper than guns had been for the most part in the United States before the Second World War. And two, they are military style firearms. And they are actual military firearms. These are guns that were used during the Second World War. They were taken from battlefields and from European militaries after the Second World War. There was a whole host of American entrepreneurs who were going over to Europe after the Second World War and just sweeping out these warehouses and buying up hundreds of thousands, millions over the course of a couple of decades, cheap military firearms that they bring back to the United States. And they start selling on the civilian market in the United States because it's really the only place in the world where you can do this. And so this gives Americans not just an appetite for guns, but an appetite for cheap guns and an appetite for cheap military guns. And in some ways, this is a moment where Americans feel this sense of triumph about the war, and there's a sense that they are entitled to the war's bounty. They won the war, and they get the guns. And so I argue in the book that this cheap availability of war surplus weapons, it really kickstarts that consumer market after the Second World War, and it's where I think we could trace the origins of that moment where we go from 45 million guns to maybe 450 million guns today.
Wow. Yeah. And a big part of that story is this guy, Samuel Cummings, who
Yeah.
comes across as kind of like Orson Welles in The Third Man, this kind of scheming American taking advantage of the post-war era to kind of manipulate markets and make money off of Europe's travesty by selling guns to Americans. It's really, really an incredible chapter in your book.
Yeah, he's such a fascinating figure. And again, I think maybe the one person most responsible for inventing what we call gun culture today, which is, I define as this, it's a consumer culture, and it's a consumer culture built around access to or demanding access to, unrestricted access to a consumer firearms market, so often defined by the military style of guns. And so he's the greatest kind of entrepreneur of this era. He's the one who first really goes over to Europe and figures out he can buy hundreds of thousands of guns for less than $1 a piece. And he is this just sort of swaggering American character. He's really young too, and people describe him as he looks like a Boy Scout, kind of chubby and boyish looking, and he's only in his 20s at this point, and he's walking into defense ministries in places like Italy and Finland and France, and he's just throwing down suitcases of cash and saying, how many guns can I carry away? And these are countries that, what are they going to do with hundreds of thousands of war rifles? On the one hand, they're not going to sell them to their populations, right? Because they're not going to redistribute all of these weapons of war to remind people of the horror and tragedy that just happened, and they're trying to preserve some sense of security. But then on the other hand, it's like these guns are expensive to maintain. And so, here comes a guy throwing down money saying, I'll take these guns off your hands. I'll ship them. I'll take this problem away from you. Plus, these are also countries that are at that moment upgrading a lot of their military capacity. So, one thing you often see in Call of Duty games is guns with the firing 5.56 rounds, right? So 5.56 millimeters that's a measure of barrel width, and that becomes the NATO standard in the early 1950s. And so a lot of European militaries are tossing away their old rifles from the World War II era and adopting new 5.56 models. So 5.56 is the equivalent of a 223, right? So 223 is the round that something like an AR-15 fires, or an M16, the military version of the AR-15. They fire rounds that are 223 caliber, right? So that's just a measure of the barrel width. In Europe, they measure with millimeters, and so it's the 5.56. And so lots of European nations are adopting that NATO standard at that moment. And someone like Sam Cummings, he's the guy who's swooping in and saying, I know you're upgrading, give me all the old stuff. And he's bringing it back, selling it in the United States, and making just boatloads of money off of it. By the end of the 1950s, he's already probably the world's largest private arms dealer, and certainly so by the end of the 1960s. And he makes most of his money just selling cheap guns to Americans.
Yeah. Well, I've got to move on to the next question here, and I'm probably going to get killed. So your book places emphasis on several touchstone moments in American history that escalated gun capitalism. Oh, there it is. Touchstone moments that escalated gun capitalism and ownership. You talk about the early Cold War, or the Red Scare, as one of these moments. Civil rights movements, particularly the riots in the late 1960s, as another. 9/11, of course, and then the election of President Obama in 2008. And I'm wondering, could you tell us generally, how did gun manufacturers, how did gun distributors utilize these particular moments to further their bottom lines?
Yeah, it's a kind of it's a funny question because gun makers often get caught off guard at these moments. These are moments when demand for firearms spikes. The first, maybe the most important of these moments is in 1967 and 1968. And if you think about what's going on in the United States at that moment, in 1967, we have several major urban uprisings in the United States, Black Americans demanding that authorities address police brutality, that they're rebelling against the lack of economic opportunity and so forth. And we so see cities like Newark and Detroit just erupt as a consequence of these political and social developments. And gun makers just aren't ready for that moment. They don't expect Americans to sort of rush out to buy guns. And so what happens is you see a high demand, and a lot of the surplus that's sitting in gun stores and in warehouses ready to be sold to Americans at that moment, it gets gobbled up. And then at that moment, gun makers say, oh, we've got to meet this demand. We got to start making a lot of guns. And so they make a lot of guns, and then they're often themselves stuck with surplus later on. This really happens again in the 2010s, especially in the aftermath of Sandy Hook. And 20 gun sales spike after Sandy Hook in December of 2012. And gun makers respond not just by making a lot of money by selling guns to people who believe that what's going to happen is AR-15s and AR style rifles are going to be banned, but also that there's going to be tremendous demand for this in the future. And so gun makers start escalating their sales. And every time they escalate their sales, they're in these moments, they're kind of caught off guard. They have to figure out later on down the road, how are we going to get rid of this surplus of arms? And so there's always this sort of weird cycle of demand increases, the gun makers ratchet up production to meet demand, and now they got to figure out how to get rid of all that production. And so that's where you often see new kind of innovative, and I say innovative, it's innovative in not necessarily a great way, but these are capitalist innovations. Like, how do we sell things? How do we develop new markets? That's where you see them turning to new ideas, and for instance, turning to video games as a place where they can generate demand for the incredible supply of guns that they've produced.
Yeah, and I love that about your book is, talking about the gun debate in America, talking about gun culture in America. It's always written through kind of cultural signifiers and, discussing cultural history when we get to talking about kind of the historical antecedents to America's current situation with guns. But yours really steps back and takes it from the perspective of capitalism and material culture, and how these trends are as much about markets as they are about kind of cultural changes. And I think that argument was really effective in your book.
Yeah, thanks. And I just take the position of, I guess, a lot of what, more sort of cultural historians might take, which is that every one of these myths we have about guns is something that was created and invented at a certain moment and with a particular motivation and intention, right? I mean, you can trace a lot of the stories Americans tell about themselves and their guns to gun companies, not necessarily to, the 1791 and the Second Amendment or the frontier. I mean, it's people like Samuel Colt and Oliver Winchester who are selling Americans these stories. And I argue after the Second World War, it's people like Samuel Cummings who also come to sell American stories about guns.
Or even misstating the Second Amendment to 1776, which
that's right. I love that
happens,
one. You can just find so much good merch out there. That's like Second Amendments in 1776 or something like that. Yeah.
I spent the first two questions in this episode talking about periodization because I think it's a really important part of the argument to your book, taking the gun debate argument out of the 18th century and kind of placing it firmly in post-war America. But another reason why I wanted to start by talking about periodization is because Call of Duty as a game series is also obsessed with specific touchstone moments in modern American life. The early games are set in World War II, while the modern warfare games are all, rely on a grounding of post 9/11 American history and the war on terror. And so I'm wondering, what do you make of the fact that this game series that revels in guns and gun culture is obsessed with the same periods of history that bookend your study in gun country?
Yeah, it's almost too perfect. It's like it's making the argument for me that our gun culture really is a creation of this post World War II era. And again, that's not to say that there was no gun culture in the United States in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and so forth. Of course, there was, but that culture changes after the Second World War, as all cultures inevitably change, right? I mean, this is something that's sort of standard for historians to understand, is that there is no such thing as a culture that transcends time and place. Cultures are things that always change. Ideas and symbols and values always change over time. And so for me, in the post-war era, it becomes about gun culture becomes about the consumer market and protecting that market, and especially protecting that market for Americans' access to what we today often call weapons of war, right? And so when we hear these debates today about what kinds of guns people should and shouldn't be allowed to have, you'll often hear the gun control politicians say that we need to ban weapons of war. This is the phrase they use over and over again.
Hmm.
And this isn't a new thing. This isn't a new conversation that we're only having today about weapons of war. This is the same one Congress was having back in the 1960s. Because the thing that kicks off kind of the post-war, the first major surge of gun control political activity after the Second World War, it's the killing of John F. Kennedy. So Kennedy's
Yeah.
killed in November 22nd, 1963, and he is killed allegedly with a I'm not going into that. He is allegedly killed with a weapon of war, right? So the gun that Lee Harvey Oswald uses, Lee Harvey Oswald definitely used this particular gun, is a Carcano, which is an Italian-made military rifle, right? And so this is one of the millions of military-style or actual military rifles and weapons coming into the United States after the Second World War. And this sets off a whole year's worth of debates in Congress and in state legislatures and so forth about the kinds of guns that Americans should have access to. And eventually it's going to culminate in the Gun Control Act of 1968, which brings on a whole other assorted number of problems. But it's just so emblematic of the Americans' relationship to guns after 1945 that a game like this is replicating that, right? I mean, I don't know the last time I played a World War II era Call of Duty game, but undoubtedly the rifles you're carrying in those games are rifles that were available to Americans to buy on the secondhand market, on the private civilian consumer market after the Second World War. And it's not just American rifles. So the Garand is the M1 is the kind of the standard American issue issue rifle during the Second World War. A semi-automatic rifle, but also plenty of rifles that you get from other countries like Mausers, which is a bolt action rifle from originally made in Germany, but you could get in dozens of countries by the Second World War. It's kind of in its own way the AR-15 of its era, in that it spawns all kinds of copycats. The Carcano is essentially one of those kinds of copycats of the Mauser, which is produced in Italy. And so I haven't played a World War II Call of Duty game in a while, but I'm sure all of those guns are available to probably also Arisaka rifles, which are the standard issue for Japanese troops in the Pacific. And so it's amazing that, at the consumer market was flooded with these things in the 1950s and the 1960s. It's really the golden age of gun buying, and Call of Duty has replicated that.
Yeah, no question. I am going to, let's see, I think there's about 5 minutes left in this match. I'm going to go ahead and leave this match so that
That's a
we
nice
can get.
gold rifle you've got there,
I
Bob.
know I'm a little bit sad to leave that
Oh, did you
behind.
steal that from? Did you
I
steal that from
did.
somebody?
I did, but I wanted to, for the next part of this conversation, I wanted to talk a little bit more in detail about the way that this game kind of portrays guns. And in particular, we've got this is all Modern Warfare 3 multiplayer screens. So you've got the match list of the different type of games that you can join. But then you've got the screen here showing your personal arsenal, and including the perks that you've got available, as well as your loadout, which can be edited. So if we go over here, and it's still giving me tooltips here. If we go over here, we can see the weapons that I've unlocked so far. And with the Call of Duty series, it's one that is very focused on weaponry, on the technological capability of these weapons, and also featuring, in many cases, brand name weapons. And so that brings us to the next question. We recently learned at the end of October, thanks to a Wall Street Journal article, that Remington, a gun manufacturer in the United States, partnered with Activision Blizzard to market their semi-automatic rifle, the ACR, in the original Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. This is the game that was published back in 2009. So I'm wondering, as the author of Gun Country, what do you make of this story? And do you think it represents a new trend in gun marketing, or is it simply more of what's come before?
Yeah, I think it's an evolution of what's come before. I mean, this shows the various innovations that gun capitalism has gone through in the post-war era. I mean, these are really smart people running these companies, and they want to sell guns and they want to make money, because that's what capitalism is all about. And what they're trying to do after, especially after 9/11, is they're trying to get ahead in a very competitive market to sell these guns. And by market, we mean a civilian market. So most of these guns versions of them are made for military use. All of the guns, I assume, that we see in Call of Duty are the military versions of these guns, right? So if you take something like the iconic AR-15, that is a civilian model. And what makes it a civilian model is that it does not have automatic fire. That's the only thing that makes it a civilian model. If you produce that exact firearm and include an automatic fire option, or a burst fire option, that's often a common one too, where you pull the trigger, it'll fire 3 rounds and stop until you pull the trigger again. If you have an automatic fire option, then it can only be a military firearm, right? So that's the only. Now there can be lots of differences between AR-15s and M16s based on various accessories and so forth. But the thing that defines it as civilian or military is the ability to fire automatically. And so a lot of these weapons, they come back on the market after 2004. 2004 is a really important moment because that's when the assault weapons ban expires. And that assault weapons ban had been passed in 1994. And the idea was to get guns like AR-15s and AK-47s, the civilian models of these guns, off of the streets because they had been used in several high-profile shootings. They were commonly used in sort of gang warfare in inner cities and so forth. And so Congress passes the assault weapons ban in 1994. Now, what happens is gun companies they basically continue selling the same kinds of guns. They just change a few features here and there so that it can get past the ban. And in fact, a lot of them they relabel these models AB, like the AR AB model or something like that, which is to say after ban, which is to say, like, we were able to, you can sell this on the civilian market because it no longer violates various laws. But after 2004, it's not just the law expiring. It's the kind of pent-up consumer demand that unleashes, that gun companies are now free to market these things as military weapons, as military style weapons. And they're doing this in the context of American troops in Afghanistan and Iraq, of young men seeing images of American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan carrying M16s, carrying M4s, carrying all of these various firearms that are military firearms that they can now buy civilian versions of. It also helps that in 2005, Congress passes something called the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, PLACA, it's sometimes called, which essentially frees gun makers from any legal liability for their firearms doing what they're supposed to do, which is harm and kill people who are targeted by them. And so this unchains the gun market, and it's a highly competitive market after 2004, 2005 for AR-style rifles, for various military-style rifles. And so any kind of competitive edge you can get, gun makers are going to try and take advantage of that. And so I think that's one place we see the marketing in video games coming in. You know, there's also advances in video game technology, right? I mean,
Yes.
look at these images. These guns look incredible, right? I mean, if you zoomed in on this is as high fidelity and quality as you can get. The game manufacturers by this era, by the late 2000s, are able to go to gun manufacturers and take, you know, high quality images of every aspect of these guns and replicate them in 3D in near perfection, right? In ways they couldn't have done 10 years earlier or 15 years earlier, when we think about, you know, what guns look like in Doom or Wolfenstein or something like that, right? And so, you know, there's we know all this information now about what companies like Remington were doing in this era. Remington's owned by is bought in this era by a big conglomerate called Freedom Group. Of course, they're called Freedom Group. There's a recent book by Cameron McWhirter and Zusha Ellenson. It's called American Gun, and it's about the AR-15. And they talk a bit about the game makers calling, asking about these guns. And you know, the gun makers are eager to take advantage of that. They see this new market here for boys and young men. McWhirter and Ellenson, they refer to, or they quote one gun executive referring to this as seed planting. That's the word the phrase he uses for putting these guns in there. They quote from a confidential memo. A lot of these memos came out as a consequence. Some of it came out because of the lawsuit against Activision Blizzard, the monopoly lawsuit, but a lot of it came out earlier as a result of the lawsuits against Remington for the marketing of the AR-15, the Bushmaster, which is the gun used in Sandy Hook in 2012. And so there's this one Freedom Group memo where's the quote here? It says, with increasing urbanization and access to shooting hunting areas in decline, a primary means for young potential shooters to come into contact with firearms and ammunition is through virtual gaming scenarios. Gaming allows millennials without access to shooting facilities or mentors to be exposed to shooting. And so Freedom Group wants to create what they call, they use the phrase brand preference with these video games, right? Is they know that these video games are going to prompt young people to go out and buy guns, which is not to say that young people are going out to buy guns to commit crimes, because most guns will never be used in crimes, but this is nevertheless flooding a market with firearms, and they want a brand preference, right? And the memo goes on to talk about how guns should appear in games. They could be used for things like hunting or for military service, or even in non-military situations, as long as the in-game shooter was acting legally and ethically. But any situation in which you're not acting legally or ethically, then the gun branding shouldn't appear. Right. And so it brings up a question of what acting ethically even means in these video games. There's plenty of ways in, you know, multiplayer situations here to commit outright war crimes in a video game. And, you know, one executive talked about how successful it was. This was his quote from an email. It really is irony that video games that just a decade ago were considered the #1 threat to gaining new shooters is perhaps now the #1 draw. So thinking about kind of changes in culture and how guns have been marketed through that. There was also the McWhorter and Ellenson mentioned one gun executive who didn't want to use video games, and the video game companies came calling and said, we'll come photograph your gun and we'll put a 3D model of it in all of our games. As far as I know, there wasn't any money exchanged in this. It was kind of like a sort of, this is good for all of us kind of thing.
Cross promotional. Yeah.
Right. That executive said, I didn't want to be part of using our brand name to teach kids how to kill humans. Which is an incredible kind of admission from somebody who manufactures AR style rifles. So
yeah. So in terms of gameplay, and I've got the progression chart shown for my character here as my online character, level 12, specialist 2 so far.
You're doing really well, Bob. You're doing, congratulations
thanks.
on all your success.
So in terms of gameplay, Call of Duty is a series that's famous for a progressive multiplayer system, which revolutionized online gaming with Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, which came out all the way back in 2007 when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And so progressive multiplayer is a system of multiplayer in which the player can unlock new abilities, cosmetics, and perks based on their time in the game, not necessarily even playing well. You can see that I've unlocked things, even though I've basically been getting murdered for hours on end here. So this style of multiplayer was a really pivotal moment in games because it did away with older multiplayer games like Doom and Unreal Tournament, which were based on an equal playing field, just built on killing your opponent, right? Deathmatch. And instead, since Call of Duty 4, since Modern Warfare came out in 2007, most online multiplayer games have been replaced with this progressive system in which you are building up your character in much the same way you would in a role-playing game. And you have this sort of aspirational system of advancement where you are attempting to gain levels while playing online, and using that as the basis to unlock perks, unlock cosmetics, and then most importantly, unlock new guns and new gun attachments. So I'm wondering, you can see here on the screen that this system of progressive multiplayer is alive and well here in Modern Warfare 3. And I'm wondering, Drew, do you think that this progressive system represents an important gateway to players for gun capitalism?
Yeah, definitely. But I don't think it's something necessarily exclusive to gun capitalism. But this is an instance of gun capitalism borrowing from the broader consumer culture. And that's why I think it's important to see guns as consumer objects, which is to say that they're not just inanimate objects or everyday tools, but they are goods that have been produced through an elaborate system of acquisition and processing of raw materials into finished goods. They make their way around the country and the world through sophisticated logistics networks. They're marketed in a way that tells a story about them and imbues the object with some kind of meaning, and they exist within a broader consumer-oriented industry that is always looking for new ways to get people excited and to go out to the gun store or to hop online and order some new accessory or whatever, which you can do. You can buy gun accessories online, and you look at some gun websites for accessories, and they kind of look like this. This user interface is shockingly similar to what you might find in some online gun stores. To purchase a gun itself, you have to go through a local dealer. You can order it online, but you still have to go pick it up at a local dealer because you have to go through the federal background check system. So I think this is, it's gun capitalism borrowing from broader consumer trends. And those trends, too, have been defined by the tech industry, by the kinds of companies that are that create these games, right? I mean, I think the feedback loop for progression in a game like Call of Duty is similar to the feedback loop in lots of other kind of games you get that are not military style games, that are not about shooting, killing other people. And that's advances in game design, that's advances in user interface design related to the various communications technologies we have, like smartphones and things like that. But in a sense, I think gun culture is not all that different from custom car culture, or something about PC gaming culture. It's about shopping
Horrific
for the
vice.
newest.
Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. And I think a lot of gun owners would say that too. It's about shopping for the newest kind of custom accessories that are going to make your car or your PC or your gun special to you. And all of that accessorizing is a way of can be a way of communicating to others something about you, right? We used to call this, with a negative connotation, conspicuous consumption. And though I think scholars of consumerism are more empathetic to this kind of consumption nowadays, maybe you want to show people your politics by slapping a Blue Lives Matter Punisher skull on your custom AR. Or alternatively, you want to communicate your left libertarian politics, an admittedly much smaller group, with designs and stuff and that represents who you are on your gun. They're customizable, and that's such a big part of the appeal. Which is also a big part of the appeal for so many other consumer goods. Gun industry people, and this isn't just me, but gun industry people have compared them to Barbies or Legos for adults in that way. So in this sense, the gun companies have followed broader trends in consumer culture, because we know that that's what sort of hooks people into a sort of subculture. There's a lot of writing about this too, with like Japanese popular culture, things like Pokemon and various anime and manga properties. It's about that customization. It's about bringing these things, feeling like you're part of this world. Look at these adorable little icons
Charms.
here, little
Yeah.
charms you can.
They're like little Funko Pops for your weapon.
That's right. That's right. And that's right. That you can put on your murder machine. And what allows for all this too, it's important to point out, because one thing we don't want to do is like fetishize guns in the way that sees them as these sort of magical objects that appear out of nowhere, but they are the product of capitalism, right? And so what allows for this kind of accessorization and customization is rapid manufacturing turnaround. The ease today of sending a design for some plastic accessory, like all of these little charms or whatever, to China and getting a container ship full of them a few weeks later. The quick turnaround of cheap crap in American consumer capitalism allows for this kind of consumer culture to develop. In a way, it's like what's called fast fashion, right? In that sense, it's chasing short-term consumer trends with cheaply manufactured junk, and it keeps people invested in the culture, in the subculture. They're constantly looking for new ways to update what they have, to remake what they have. And so the AR was so crucial in that sense, that on the one hand, it is a mass-produced weapon of violence, like so many rifles that came before it, but its specific design was meant to be easily customizable, removing parts, switching out different kinds of parts, intentionally for military purposes, to make it more flexible for military forces. I mean, the AR-15 comes out of this moment in the late 1950s, when the U.S. Army is looking for a more flexible rifle than the older, heavier standard issue rifles that they had. And so Eugene Stoner, he's the creator of the AR-15. That was his idea: something cheap, something light, something flexible in terms of the switchability of its parts. And that was also that also plays well into consumer culture.
Yeah. And, with the kind of customizability of this weapon, framing it in terms of consumer culture, not only do you have different skins and stickers for the gun itself, but even the ammunition here, you can slap on a different type of skin. Even the bullets are customizable. Like it's just remarkable. And I think you make a great point. A lot of other games do the same sort of thing. They include progressive multiplayer systems. They include character skins. They include new perks, new abilities, new adornments for your weaponry. But I feel like, this kind of the importance of guns to Call of Duty and this progressive multiplayer system is really central, because with a lot of the other really popular online multiplayer systems with progressive multiplayer, like Fortnite, those are third person action games. So when
Mhm.
you're talking about progressive multiplayer, it's a lot of focus on what your player character looks like, right? Because you can actually see your character in
Mhm.
a third person game. Whereas in Call of Duty, a first person game, you can have a different look for your player character, the actual person you're controlling. You can add charms, you can add different skins to them, you can add, little stickers and whatnot. But the only thing that you're actually seeing when you're playing Call of Duty is your gun. That's it,
Mhm.
right? So the most important progression, and you could see it here on this screen, the most important progression has to do with your weapon, what weapon you're using, and then what it looks like. Does it look amazing? Does it look dope? And, the funny thing is, as I was playing multiplayer earlier, you can, start low, but then as you're playing other players that have gotten farther along in the system than you, and you manage to take them out, or somebody else takes them out, you can pick up their guns, right? And
Mhm.
then so it's like this momentary thing of, look at this treasure that I've found. Doesn't this like make me look so much cooler? Isn't this weapon so cool? I can't wait until I can afford this weapon, either through progression or maybe by going to the marketplace and buying it.
That's right. That's right. You can't wait until you too can get your sparkly purple flashing alien looking rifle. Yeah.
So, a last question here, and this one has to do with kind of the general culture around Call of Duty, but then also game culture in general. This apparatus of gun fetishization around Call of Duty doesn't just exist in the game. The two biggest gaming websites in the world, IGN and GameSpot, both publish regular videos featuring experts discussing the guns in these types of games. So I've got to kind of remove myself from this question, because I'm somebody who publishes videos online with experts, quote unquote. But I'm wondering, Drew, given your knowledge of gun capitalism in the United States, what do you make of this type of coverage coming from IGN and GameSpot?
Yeah, you use the word fetish, and fetish is a good word for it. One of the contradictions of the gun rights movement is insisting that guns are they're merely tools. They're everyday kind of common tools for people. They're not these sort of magical objects that the gun control movement makes them out to be. They're not these tools of evil and so forth. And yet nobody's fetishized guns more than the gun rights movement, which is
Hmm.
to say that the movement has instilled deep and sort of inscrutable mystical meaning in guns. These are totems that connect the present to the past, that represent all the values of what it means to be a man in America in the 20th and 21st century. That said, I think there are a lot of different reasons people find guns interesting and exciting. They're not for everyone simply tools of violence and repression, or even, now today, they're often marketed as weapons of insurrection. I personally think guns are fascinating as pieces of technology. When I fire a gun, it triggers all those sections in my brain that kind of marvel at human engineering ingenuity. One of the arguments of the book is that the cheapness of guns, the easy availability of cheap guns specifically, first because of all these imports from overseas, and later because Americans figure out how to make them so cheaply. That fascinates me, thinking about how this really what is just a cheap piece of crap,
Hmm.
plastic and metal, because that's what's ultimately so many of these AR style rifles are. They're just absurdly cheap, so much cheaper to make than their counterparts 75 years ago. And that's why gun companies make such incredible profits off of these things. It fascinates me that this cheap piece of plastic and metal can send a bullet out of the barrel at thousands of feet per second. What an absolute engineering marvel. And I think a lot of gun aficionados see them that way too. Though at the same time, I'm not sure it's easy to kind of disentangle that from the various ways they're marketed as essential tools of self-defense, as America's rifle, which then some abstract way preserves freedom for American citizens. And so, it is part of, I have no doubt that these videos by IGN or GameSpot or whatever it is, they're connected to some broader gun capitalist institution, whether there's some gun manufacturer that's sponsoring them, or a gun retailer or something that's or some gun influencer that's looking for extra likes or something like that. So on the one hand, it's another evolution of gun capitalism, but on the other hand, they are kind of fascinating pieces of technology, and I watch a lot of these videos myself. I am not an expert on guns. I don't think in order to talk about the impact of guns on American society, you necessarily need to be an expert on all of the various mechanisms of a gun or the various models of guns, in part because there are, many hundreds or thousands of them at this point. But, it's the equivalent of saying, like, you can't understand how cars have affected American culture unless you know how an internal combustion engine works, down to the last bolt and piston and so forth. And so, yeah, part of me thinks like these things they can be sort of harmless, tapping into a kind of innate human fascination with technology and how it works. But then on the other hand, guns, these kind of guns can be marketed as tools of violence, as tools of insurrection, as tools to be used to, because you fear your community, because you fear the people in it, because you fear internal subversion or something like that. So I don't know. I'm ambivalent, I suppose, about that.
Okay. Well, on that ambivalent note, that's going to do it for this episode of History Respawned. Drew, thank you very much for joining me on this episode.
Bob, thanks so much for having me. Again, I appreciate all the work you do, and I'm very excited to get my chance to talk about video games and history.
Awesome. And on a special note, we wanted to thank Carl McKevitt for making this episode possible. And to the listener, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you enjoy History Respawned and are interested in our back catalog, please come and visit historyrespawned.com. And if you really enjoy our work and want to support us, please visit us on Patreon at patreon.com/History Respawned. And until next time, goodbye.